If you're an author or plan to be one, get excited because this podcast is for you. Book Marketing Mentors is the only podcast dedicated to helping you successfully market and sell your book. If you're ready for empowering conversations with successful marketing mavens, then grab a coffee or tea and listen in to your host, international best-selling author Susan Friedman.
Welcome to Book Marketing Mentors, the weekly podcast where you learn proven strategies, tools, ideas, and tips from the masters. Every week, I introduce you to a marketing master who will share their expertise to help you market and sell more books. Today, my special guest is known as the podcasting queen. Annemarie Cross loves learning, starting, and launching new creative products and being involved in multiple things at any one time. She's CEO and founder of the Ambitious Entrepreneur Podcast Network and Industry Thought Leader Academy. Communicate Now, her podcast production and consulting agency, works with businesses to create and produce their podcast series and podcast platform so they can become known as an influential voice in their industry. She's the author of Industry Thought Leader, How to Go from Invisible to Influential and Profitable with a podcast all the way from Melbourne, Australia. Annemarie, what an absolute pleasure it is to welcome you to the show, and thank you for being this week's guest expert and mentor.
Thank you, Susan. It's such an honor to be here with you today.
I love talking to other podcasters. We can really get into some nitty-gritty here, and especially the fact that you're over 10,000 miles away. That's even more incredible. So,
isn't it? The technology that we have at our fingertips today is just amazing.
I know. I mean, you sound the same as I'm speaking to somebody who's in the next state over. So, any event, Annemarie, let's get down to business here. I am absolutely fascinated to know that you started podcasting 12 years ago when podcasting was just getting started. It was in its infancy. What attracted you to doing podcasting?
That takes me right back to 2008. And that was when the global financial crisis hit worldwide. I was working in the career industry back then as a career coach, personal branding strategist, and we had clients all over the world. And a colleague and I were so disillusioned at the doom and gloom that many of the mainstream media platforms, so at that stage we're talking print, we're talking radio and television, we're talking about the doom and gloom, and it was impacting people's psyche. We knew things were tough, but we knew that things were not impossible. There was certainly hope. So we said, you know what, we need to be the voice of hope and inspiration amongst all of this doom and gloom. And let's start an online radio show. Back then, really, the word podcast wasn't used as frequently. Actually, for years after we did start podcasting, people would say, what's a podcast? So thankfully, we've gone full circle. Lots more people now know what a podcast is and have one, which is wonderful. We did that for 2 years to really bring different strategies and what people needed to do in order to really position themselves in a tough marketplace. And we did that for 2 years. My co-host, went one way and I continued working more with entrepreneurs and, branding, getting them online. But we've always had a podcast as part of my business, strategy, marketing, reach, all of that. And now it's gone full circle where I'm helping other business owners to really set their platforms up, but building reach, building that reputation as a trusted authority, and ultimately their revenue using their podcast as a major component to support them in doing that.
That's excellent. As you know, most of the listeners here are authors, nonfiction authors, few fiction authors, authors to be, and many of them have thought about or are thinking about doing a podcast. If that's the case, where would they start with this process?
Yes, and it's not often where many people think they should start. People often say, well, what piece of technology, what's the best microphone? One of the things that I say, especially if you're looking at building reach, building that reputation as that go-to person in your industry, or even if you're wanting to elevate the brand awareness of your book, you have to start with your end in mind. And by doing that, you're very clear on your outcomes, and then you can implement the right strategy, the right steps to be able to support you in achieving the goal. And one of the myths that I often say, Susan, is that your microphone should not be the first thing. In fact, message before make or model of the microphone is going to make the difference. Because if you think about your message, now we have so many more podcasts. I think we're over 1 million now, which is still relatively a small number compared to how many blogs and how many emails are going out on a daily basis. But we want to be able to cut through the noise, and we have to be clear on that. The first thing that I would say is, know why are you doing this? What is the purpose for you from the onset? What is it that you want to achieve? Because there are different components that you put into your overall podcast and marketing strategy that can support you in achieving that. Not all strategies are the same. So what is the end in mind? And then you can implement the various steps to be able to support you in getting there, but get clear on that first.
Excellent. And so many of my authors are looking at getting into a niche market. And so I think this would really help them stand out from their competitors and be seen and heard as a thought leader in their industry. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And all of the things that I'm sure you also share with your clients about how to position their book and obviously how to position themselves. Because ultimately what we're doing, aren't we, if we're using a book as a way to build reach and our reputation as that thought leader, ultimately, yes, the sale of the book, but also what are some of the services and programs, consulting, speaking, all of those different ways to be able to monetize that. That's so important when it comes to establishing or setting up your podcast, as well as even right from the topic. Some of the mistakes I made, or one of the mistakes that I made, was not clearly understanding my core niche. In fact, I shut down. People often look at me horrified when I say I shut down the production of my award-winning podcast, which still gets named. Tony Robbins kind of featured it just a couple of months ago in one of his trainings to 34,000 people who were going through his course. The reason I shut it down was my message got lost in the noise of my own podcast, because I was interviewing lots of people and it was great. People loved it. But really, if I took a step back, I thought I'm not really building my thought leadership of my own because I haven't got clear on that. And that can often happen, if you don't have even the right guesting strategy when it comes to your podcast. It's so important to niche.
Yes, and I always know when people pitch me to be interviewed on this podcast, if they come through often a public relations agency and they say, oh, we've got a brand new book, we want to talk about it. I was like, no, this is not about talking about your book. This is about how can you help my listeners with some marketing tips and techniques that will help them. I always know when they don't really know and understand what my particular podcast is all about. Now, how about monetizing a podcast? I know that we put so much time and energy into this, but how can we monetize it?
Yes. Well, with people who are writing a book and starting a podcast as a way to elevate their reputation as a trusted authority, that thought leader, have a body of knowledge that obviously they're able to consult, they're able to put coaching programs together, or maybe even products, or a combination of those things. And so one of the other myths that often I talk about is that when you're starting a podcast, please do not compare it to mainstream media or mainstream radio. Podcast is a completely different vehicle. You have the ability to build such deep engagement with your ideal client, your community, if you have the right strategy in place. So monetize your own message before you monetize someone else's. And the number of times I've spoken to business owners who are also authors who said, I've been interviewing people and every now and again or maybe at the end I'll do a call to action and sharing a little bit about what's coming up in my programs and things like that. Or we'll put an ad in. I mean, podcast audience are listening and often will subscribe to your podcast because they love you. They love the content that you share. And so please do not use, that advertising push in your face. You monetize your own message. So your podcast needs to speak into the challenges, the obstacles, the insights, the solutions that your ideal client would find valuable through the guests that you bring on, as well as too having some solo shows so that you can really continue to build that engagement. But what you can do is your podcast is part of you nurturing your ideal clients through the buyer's journey so that when they come to the decision and, I need to do something different. I need to make a decision. And the only person that I can even think of working with is, obviously the podcast host, author, because they know what they're talking about. And I love the experience that I get when I'm listening to their podcast. So you monetize your own message. I've even had people that I've interviewed as guests who have said, do you have a few minutes after we speak? And they've hired me. Not that that is one of the main strategies, but your ideal clients should be the audience that are listening to your podcast. Every single episode that you release is continuing to nurture that relationship.
Yes, and I don't know everybody who's listening. It's really interesting when people contact me and they say, oh, I love your podcast. And the other day, a lady actually from Zambia said, I go to bed listening to your podcast. I was like, oh my goodness. I love the fact that somebody's taking me to bed with them.
Yes, exactly. You just don't know. But that's when, and I call this my podcast profit pipeline. Your pipeline has to incorporate other touch points. Your podcast may just be the very first thing that they may listen to. And if you're an author, one of the things that you would want to incorporate is some form of ebook or some chapters or things. There's a whole strategy that you can do. But one of the things that I now teach my clients and encourage people to do is when you're starting out with your podcast, if you have an existing podcast, you can still do the strategy, but it's slightly different. Your first 3 episodes, especially if you're wanting to nurture listeners into leads, inquiries, and paying customers, and you've got some kind of more high-end programs and things like that, but you're wanting to really build that trusted authority, your first 3 episodes, in fact, episode 0, it starts with episode 0. The first 3 episodes are you speaking into the challenges, solutions, all of that of your podcast, and that becomes your opt-in from your podcast, your call to action. Anytime that you are being interviewed or you are interviewing other people, the call to action is going to nurture those people who have just listened to that topic and loved it and who may want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the things that you teach and can support them with. That's where you've got this funnel that starts to be built. And there's a whole reason why we do that. And that's something that I came up with that strategy after accidentally generating 2 4-figure clients from 3 podcast episodes that I launched from one of my podcasts that I started after one of my business's worst failures. And I thought, I'm going to start up this new podcast just to get me through this interim. And lo and behold, 2 clients. I thought, wow, if I can do that by accident, what could happen if I backtrack the steps and did it purposefully, intentionally? And of course, that's what I did and continue now to teach. That's how you start monetizing. It's all about relationship building. And when you start to do that, you can start to then build a relationship from the people who are listening to your podcast. One of the other incredible things that will happen is people come for the topic, but they'll return for the host because they can go and listen to your particular topic that you're sharing, whether you're doing a solo show or whether you're interviewing guests. They can probably find one other podcast or maybe hundreds of other podcasts talking about a similar topic. But the reason they come back is because of how you made them feel, the experience that you created on your podcast. That's what you want to really consider. This podcast is fantastic, a way to start building that relationship. And then you seed and lead. You through the opt-in and through maybe a community that you're building. And that just nurtures those listeners to become part of your community so that you can then get to know them on a deeper, basis too. Because like that listener that reached out to you, Susan, said, well, I listen to you when I'm in bed. That's the kind of thing that will happen. Your community will want to reach out to you because just of who you are and how you make them feel, the experience you create.
I love that. That's beautiful. And that whole experience, being on purpose came from a failure, and how many businesses have started that way when something failed and then all of a sudden they're like,
Yes.
maybe if I turn this around, this could be done on purpose. So yes, I love it. Now, in your book, Annemarie, you talk about busting common podcasting myths. That intrigues me. I need to know, and I'm sure our listeners would love to learn about some of those podcasting myths. Can you share one or two of them with us?
Yes, I can. Well, one I've already hinted to, and that is focus on the message and monetization strategy before you worry about the microphone or the make model of the microphone, because you cannot edit and mix compelling content that converts, that nurtures your ideal customer from listener to lead, inquiry, and ultimately paying customer. That's the first one. The second one is similar to one that we've heard with other ways to market, and that is, I built my website. Why aren't I getting clients from that? Well, you can use the same principle with a podcast. I've launched my podcast. Why am I not getting clients from that? And why I share that is because this is one of the reasons why my co-host and I actually stopped producing our podcast, because we struggled to monetize it. We assumed that people would listen to our podcast, love what we were talking about, rush over to our website, find out more, and then ring us up. They didn't do that because we assumed they would do that, and we based our strategy on hope. There has to be a clear strategy, a call to action, but all of the content that you share has to be compelling and enticing and so valuable. And especially when we talk about thought leadership, it has to stand out by cutting through the noise and innovating your industry. Don't just publish your podcast and hope clients will come and that you'll get speaking gigs and things like that. Especially if you want to build momentum, real momentum, there has to be that strategy. And the 3-part podcast series, what I shared earlier, that is really the strategy that we use. And that again is the building step one of the relationship. In business, there's a lot of different things that we know that we need to have in place. Another one that I'll often hear as well is, how do I get on to the top charts? How do I get listed and new and noteworthy? Well, guess what? Please do not focus on vanity numbers. I have had colleagues who have shut down podcasts that have had over 1 million listens because they just couldn't monetize it. They had incredible reach. They had incredible reputation, but more of a celebrity. And I talk about my podcasting positioning, your authority, a podcasting positioning quadrant, and you could become like an influencer, like a celebrity. But as potential thought leaders, aspiring thought leaders, we're selling knowledge. So if you're positioning yourself as a celebrity and influencer, even with millions of downloads, it's very difficult to monetize that. As I said, I can share a little bit more about the positioning quadrant, but there's a whole kind of formula and 3 things that you need to have in place to be able to really achieve that trusted authority. But that is something that I often hear, and I'm sure you hear too, Susan, want to get on the top charts. Well, I would much rather have a smaller, niched community of listeners who not only love listening, but who are taking action. They're my ideal clients. And they're saying, you know what, I cannot think of working with anyone else but Annemarie, or in your case, Susan, cannot think of getting published through anyone else but with Susan's support. Yeah, don't get sucked into following vanity numbers.
And that's really interesting, because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about all the authors who are saying, oh, I want to be a bestseller. I want to be a bestseller. And I'm like, okay, but then what?
Yes.
the focus is, as you say, on the vanity, on the ego, because I wanted it too. And I got it. Then I wanted to niche down and really focus on penetrating a target audience, because that in the end is far more, I say, lucrative. But being that thought leader has more impact, more authority with your target audience. I think that's far more important. But I love the fact that, you related it to the podcast and getting the number one or being most listened to. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so true. And it starts with, and in your case, writing to an audience of one. With a podcast, it's speaking to an audience of one. And if you really nail that message, if you really are changing thoughts, if you're challenging status quo, and through continuing to share your message that you are going to make a difference by being the difference and the expertise that you're sharing, that audience will grow and that trusted authority will just naturally build because you're speaking with intention, with purpose. Yeah, real innovation into that particular industry. And that's what's really going to stand out, and your audience will grow. And often then exponentially, doesn't it? Because you've taken the time to build the foundation upon which you know that your business will continue to grow.
Yes, and consistency, I think, is so important as well. I mean, I've been doing this now, as I told you, we've been going like 4 years, coming into our 5th year, and we do it every week. I missed a few weeks when my father passed away, but interestingly enough, I thought people would reach out to me and say, "Where's the podcast? What happened?" Nobody. It was crickets. It was like nothing happened. Let's talk about you. And I know that our listeners are chomping at the bit to find out more about how they can get in touch with you. Tell us a little bit about the services you offer. Take that away, Annemarie.
Oh, thank you. Well, podcastingwithpurpose.com is the website. Go there. There's lots of different resources there. But some of the ways that I support people is we've got a signature program called your 90-day idea to launch your thought leader podcast. And we take you from idea right through to launch. Now, if you're an author or even a budding author, maybe you're in the process of writing your book, podcasts can really start to build that platform. And what we look at then is the strategy. We always start off with the strategy. How are you going to start to monetize this? How can we build and create for you? You create for yourself a 3-part series that will incorporate aspects of your book so that you can start to build a relationship with your ideal client and nurture them through that pipeline that is created. That's something that we love, that program, because we are in there with our clients, really helping them really build these core foundations, especially that their podcast can then launch, and sit upon. And it's interesting that when you, particularly, I think we were talking about this before we started recording, Susan, when you are an author or an aspiring author, you're in the process of writing your book and you incorporate a podcast, and you do that well because there's a strategy that integrates the two, and then you start to share that across social media. There's something so unique and special that happens because you've got these two incredible assets that's helping you build momentum that I think is just so unique, especially now when so many more people are online and looking for inspiring content. It doesn't take long to cut through the noise, which is so exciting.
It really is, because you're right. I mean, with 1 million podcasts and growing, there is a lot of noise. But if you're in a niche market, there's less noise. So yes. I highly recommend that. In any event, I will put your link in the show notes if people weren't able to write it down, and we can get people to contact you that way. And Annemarie, if you were to leave our listeners with a golden nugget, what would that be?
Well, I think starting with the end in mind is so very important, but there's 3 things that I really just want to leave people with thinking about. And that is, if you want to build your reputation as a trusted authority, as that thought leader in your industry, particularly harnessing a book alongside a podcast, 3 things that you need to consider. Firstly, you need to build a community, a highly engaged community. And that aligns, of course, with niching. They have to have a common desire or a challenge. They need to feel connected, valued, and understood, and resonates with the culture that you are creating. Remember, you're not just sharing a message. Many of us who are wanting to make a difference in the world, we're creating culture, and often that is a movement. You need to get clear on that first. Secondly, be mindful of the content you share. I know there are so many marketers that say content, get it out there as quickly as you can, as often as you can, across as many platforms as you can. As a thought leader and as a trusted authority, less is often more. I love that paradox. Less is more. Be mindful of the content that you share. Make sure it's highly niched and relevant. Make sure it's seen as innovative and market leading, and that it is valued, trusted, and highly respected. And guess what? That's where testimonials, that's where incredible podcast hosts such as yourself, they're featuring you. And lastly, you need to consider charisma. And we hinted at this, what's your personal brand? Do you have that coming through? Are you when I'm saying confident, not arrogant, but does your present captivate? And are you influencing as you're speaking, in your writing, in your podcast? Have you cultivated that united purpose and passion in your own life so that you can just exude that as you continue to share your message? With charisma, you also influence and inspire others. And when you get those 3 components together, you not only build an audience of highly engaged people, you build your reputation as a trusted authority. You really go from expert, and there's nothing wrong with being an expert. That's fantastic. But if you want to take that up a notch and become a trusted authority, that thought leader, all of those 3 components are in place. And when you place a book and a podcast as part of your assets that you're using, you really can build that momentum.
I can totally see why you've become known as the podcasting queen. This has been amazing. And listeners, you have been introduced to so many gems here. I hope you've been able to take a few of them away with you. Annemarie, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And thank you all for taking time out of your precious day to listen to this interview. And I sincerely hope that it sparked some ideas you can use to sell more books. Here's wishing you much book marketing success.
The time is now to take action and finally build your book-selling empire. And the great news is that Susan is here to help you. Visit bookmarketingmentors.com and sign up for a free 15-minute book marketing strategy session with Susan. She'll help you discover your first steps to marketing and selling your book. Only those who take action are rewarded, so visit bookmarketingmentors.com, and we'll see you again next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.